Hello, friends, and welcome to the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. These episodes have been remastered for better sound quality by Rob at Wrong Way Recording. When you need it done right, you choose Wrong Way. WrongWayRecording.com. Initially imagined by me as a 10-part series, the Diabetes Pro Tip series has grown to 26 episodes. These episodes now exist in your audio player between episode 1000 and episode 1025. They are also available online at diabetesprotip.com and juiceboxpodcast.com. This series features myself and Jennifer Smith. Jenny is a CDE and a Type 1 for over 35 years. This series was my attempt to bring together the management ideas found within the podcast in a way that would make it digestible and revisitable. It has been so incredibly popular that these 26 episodes are responsible for well over 500,000 downloads within the Juicebox Podcast. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter. And they have an amazing offer for you. Right now, at my link only, contournext.com/juicebox free meter, you can get an absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit. That's contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1. See all of the good work they're doing for people living with Type 1 diabetes at touchedbytype1.org and on their Instagram and Facebook pages. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox.
What's on our agenda today?
We are going to talk about continuous glucose monitors.
That's a big topic.
It is, right? So I tell a story that I think is going to fit here in this episode. We were in my daughter's endocrinologist visit a long, long time ago, probably a decade ago. And the nurse practitioner asks me, are you going to get one of these CGMs? And that's how new the whole idea was. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, you know? And so she begins to tell me a story about this 17-year-old kid in the practice who loves M&Ms but can't seem to eat them without a spike. So he gets the Dexcom, which I think back then would have been the 7 Plus, maybe 10 years ago. Is that the first one with the
Probably the 7?
The 7, right?
Because I know that in 2006 is when I got my first CGM, and the 7 was on the market along with whatever came with Medtronic, and then Abbott's Navigator had come out, and that's actually the first CGM that I had, and I loved it. It was unbelievably accurate.
Yeah, I remember that one too.
Yeah, so it probably was the 7 when you were considering.
So there it is. So she's telling us about this thing called Dexcom. I don't know what it is. I don't know what she's talking about. The letters CGM mean nothing to me.
It's like Chinese, right?
I was like, it could have been any language except English. I didn't know what she was talking about. But then she tells me this story, and she says that the boy gets the glucose monitor, and he goes home to the grocery store and buys those little single-serving packs of M&Ms. But he grabs 7 of them. And the first day he goes home and he eats the M&Ms as he always would. He puts in his insulin as he always would. And he watches his blood sugar go up. And it kind of stays up after that. So the next day he thought, well, okay, I must need more insulin. So he gives himself more insulin and his blood sugar goes up less. So the third day he thought he had it fixed. He's like, this is it. I just need more. But he gives himself more. He barely goes up at all. But then he crashes low later. So the kid's like, okay. So the next day, a little sooner, a little less, a little more. And he messes around back and forth with this. And then she looks at me. I'll never forget the look on her face because she was astonished, right? And she goes, I saw his graph. He put his insulin in, ate the candy, and his blood sugar never moved. And she's telling me a story about that. And all I could think in my mind was, well, if that's possible with that, then that's possible with anything. Like, right. That's what I left with that feeling of. Like, there's information coming back to me that can do that. That's amazing because I used to be one of those people we'd go into I don't really show them the pump anymore, but we used to go in and they'd download your data, or they'd look at, your boluses and all this stuff and where your blood sugars were. And she'd say to me, hey, you tested, Arden ate lunch at noon and you tested at 12:30. She's like, why would you do that? And I said, well, don't you want to know what's happening? Like I want to know what's happening. So it was a number of years later that she said back to me, she goes, I realize now, prior to you having a glucose monitor, she's like, you were doing it yourself. Like you were trying to act as a glucose monitor. You were figuring out what was happening, which made sense to me back then.
My finger sticks prior to CGM, on average, were about 14 a day.
I'd have to say that's where we were too.
Because I literally, similar as you, I wanted to know where things were, not only before, but especially after, because it's a learning piece.
Yeah.
It's just like the M&Ms. It's how did this work or not work, and what do I need to do to make sure that it works the next time, because I like this.
Right.
Or I like to do this kind of exercise, or whatever it is.
I was so amazed just doing that. Just, it fried my mind back then, like to test and go, but she went to 300. And then 45 minutes later, she was 340, but then she fell, and like all that stuff. It was interesting information. It was valuable, but it wasn't enough. Right. Like it wasn't enough to make sense, at least for me. I couldn't make sense of it still.
Because you literally, when you do finger sticks, then you have to do the connection of the dots yourself.
Yeah, and I couldn't do that.
There's nothing in between.
I couldn't make that leap. I just couldn't figure out what, like what you're, like those gaps. Like I couldn't figure out what it was. And it's not Jurassic Park. I couldn't just use frog DNA to fill in the gaps, right? Because you
fix
see
the gaps,
you see what happens, and they're making babies by themselves, and it's not good. But you don't want to fill the data in with something unknown, is what I'm getting at.
No.
So I did as best I could. I heard her story. My goodness, I ran to get a CGM. We got the Dexcom right away. I can still remember sitting in the endo's office, right? And the nurse practitioner put it on her the first time, and Arden didn't like it. And I remember it breaking my heart. Like I remember thinking like, oh God, did that hurt? And now, with the G6, Arden honestly says like, I don't feel it at all.
Feel it?
Yeah. But back then, there she was, gosh, I don't know.
Little.
4 or 5 years old, right?
When you have diabetes and use insulin, low blood sugar can happen when you don't expect it. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use glucagon option that can treat very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes ages 2 and above. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk.
There she was, 4 or 5 years old, in this little dress, and she's so like sitting up on the table and trying to be tough and everything, and it wasn't good. But we stuck with it because of what I was getting back from it. I just found it to be amazing. And now today, I think that if you're listening to this podcast and it is of any value to you, I have to give half of the credit to the Dexcom and the other half of it to Omnipod. Like I took those two tools and figured out how to use insulin with them.
But you also have to give yourself a big part of that credit, because you took tools. It's like any kind of tool. You could have a hammer as one of the simplest tools that there is, and if you don't put it to use, it's a great tool, but it doesn't do anything else for you except sit there.
Well, you're very kind. I was avoiding saying something nice about myself, but let's do that for a second. But let's translate it out to the people listening. My goal with this podcast is just to be your M&M story, right? Like I want to hand you off tools that you then take home and learn how to become proficient with, right? I'm not going to stand with you forever. Jenny can't come to your house, right? But we're gonna throw these tools.
I've been asked many times.
Somebody said to me once, "Can you come live with me?"
Live with me for a while.
I started thinking there might be a number where I'd say yes to that, but I don't know what it is exactly.
Right.
How much would it cost for me to abandon my family? And so, guys, I'm leaving. But seriously, I genuinely mean that. Like you're going to get these tools. You learn how to use them in situations, and before you know it, they work in more and more what you would have called complex or difficult situations. Is exactly the same thing. When people come to me and say, sure, this is great, but how does this work during hormonal time or during a growth period or during illness or during, when your daughter's playing softball? I always say the same thing, exactly the same way. Those
Right.
tools
And
work
if anything,
exactly
it
the
makes
same
you
way.
more comfortable,
Of course.
right? Especially when, I mean, we talked already about insulin.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually, I mean, this tool shows you not only effective food, but more so how to be more comfortable with insulin use.
Yeah. Yep.
It does.
So not unlike the first time I thought about an insulin pump, and while everyone else was yelling, "Oh, you won't have to inject so much," I was thinking, "Ooh, I could manipulate the basal insulin." Like that seemed like the exciting part to me. And with CGM, and you probably have heard people say this before if you have considered a glucose monitor, but the most exciting thing about a CGM isn't the number that it shows you. I'm sitting here now, Arden's blood sugar 75. She got insulin for lunch. I'm going to find out when. 47 minutes ago. She was 95, 47 minutes ago when we put the insulin in. She's 75 now. So that's comforting to see that she's 75. But what you don't hear me talking about when I tell you that is that there was a moment when she was 89 diagonal down and she was drifting down. But she wasn't falling that fast. I could see how quickly she was falling. That's the information from the CGM that's just mind-blowing. Sure, she's going down, but she's going down at a speed I'm comfortable with based on the food that I know is going in, because that battle's about to start really happening. The food's really going to kick in a second. I love that she's drifting down at that moment because, you know, when lunch hits her, I like if, you know, we've talked about it before, I like the insulin to have momentum.
Right.
If you think it's about the number, you're misunderstanding the CGM. If you think about the M&M story, you have to know it's about timing and amount. It's about speed and direction, right? Like, which way is my blood sugar moving and how fast is it going? When you know that, it's everything. It's the difference between treating a 75 blood sugar and leaving it alone. So I can see right now Arden's blood sugar is steady, which means I won.
Because the trend line is horizontal and her arrow is probably horizontal.
And that arrow is still telling you something, right? Like even being horizontal, it's telling you we're steady. And Dexcom gives you the breakdown of what that means. Steady could still mean plus or minus a point every 5 minutes. But great.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
But it's happening so slowly at that horizontal arrow. They usually say that it's less than a point a minute. Right. And so, and that's where to bring in that angled arrow that you saw with the 80 something blood sugar. I mean, had it been angled up or angled down, it's still the same rate of change.
Right.
It's about 1 to 2 points per minute.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, And so when people talk about, Scott, I don't understand how you don't count carbs. So here's a way I don't count carbs.
The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter, and they have a unique offer just for listeners of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're new to Contour, you can get a free Contour Next Gen starter kit by visiting this special link, contournext.com/juicebox free meter. When you use my link, you're going to get the same accurate meter that my daughter carries. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Head there right now and get yourself the starter kit. This free kit includes the Contour Next Gen meter, 10 test strips, 10 lancets, a lancing device, control solution, and a carry case. But most importantly, it includes an incredibly accurate and easy to use blood glucose meter. This Contour meter has a bright light for nighttime viewing, an easy to read screen. It fits well in your hand and features second chance sampling, which can help you to avoid wasting strips. Every one of you has a blood glucose meter. You deserve an accurate one. contournext.com/juicebox free meter to get your absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit sent right to your door. When it's time to get more strips, you can use my link and save time and money buying your Contour Next products from the convenience of your home. It's completely possible that you will pay less out of pocket in cash for your Contour strips than you're paying now through your insurance. contournext.com/juicebox free meter. Go get yourself a free starter kit. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. Touched by Type 1 has a wide array of resources and programs for people living with type 1 diabetes. When you visit touchedbytype1.org, go up to the top of the page where it says Programs. There you're going to see all of the terrific things that Touched by Type 1 is doing. And I mean, it's a lot. Type 1 at school, the D-Box program, Golfing for Diabetes, Dancing for Diabetes, which is a terrific program. You just click on that to check that out. Bowl for a Cause, their awareness campaigns, and the annual conference that I've spoken at a number of years in a row. It's just amazing, just like Touched by Type 1. Touchedbytype1.org, or find them on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the show notes. Links at juiceboxpodcast.com to Touched by Type 1 and the other great sponsors that are supporting the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Touchedbytype1.org.
Sure, I go historical. I look at a plate and I say, I think this is 10 units, right? But Arden had pancakes this weekend. Big, homemade, not measured pancakes. And I have a feeling that pancakes are going to be 12 units-ish. So I double her basal rate for an hour and a half, 15 minutes before she gets the pancakes. Her blood sugar's already 78 then. She's coming out of bed. 10 minutes-ish before the food starts, I do the 12-unit bolus, but I take out 1 unit that I've added from the basal, right? So now it's an 11-unit bolus. I extend it out, 80% right away, 20% over an hour. Now I'm creating kind of like that blanket of insulin like we talked about. Mm-hmm. Now, if I get it wrong, I adjust. Most times I expect by getting it wrong means I won't even be aggressive enough and I'll have to come back and bump it down again. When I see a diagonal up arrow 30 minutes after pancakes, I say to myself, ooh, I messed this up. Maybe I shouldn't have extended the bolus, or maybe I should have put more up front. But anyway, I'm going to bump that arrow back down again. In this situation last weekend, I was so aggressive that I had to bail on the temp basal rate. So about 45 minutes after Arden ate, she was 70, which was fantastic. But I was like, I still have insulin going. I don't need any more, clearly. So we canceled the temp basal rate, and she rode low forever. I mean, it was great. 85, like right in there.
Right. Healthy. That's not low. That's right? Healthy. She rode healthy.
Lower than you. Yeah, of course. I definitely misspoke there. Lower than you would expect after pancakes.
Yep.
But at a great blood sugar, because I was able to use what the CGM was telling me. And what the CGM was telling me was she was starting to drift lower from like 90. And I read that drift as these pancakes are through her now to enough of a degree that we shouldn't be going down anymore.
Right.
All right. So I bail on the temp basal. I don't shut her basal off. I just go back to the regular basal rate. So we're going along like that for hours. I mean, hours and hours and hours. Nothing. There's nothing. Now I know the insulin's gone from the pancakes. Now I know the pancakes are definitely out of her body. And at some point, that arrow kind of diagonals down a little bit. And we were getting ready to go out to the mall, her and her friend. So I said to her, hey, take your vitamins, the little gummy vitamins. They must have like 6 carbs in them. She pops her vitamins in. We get in the car. The arrow kind of bangs back up a little bit again, right in that 75 area. So we get to the mall, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to ride this out to see what happens. Like, I'm not panicking here. But we were there for about 20 minutes or so, and I wasn't sure if like the excitement of the shopping was going to make her go up or not. And it didn't. She was walking around, and my wife and I left her alone, went and did something else, and I texted her at some point, hey, I think you should shut your basal off for a half an hour. And she did. And we stayed right at like 80 the whole time she was shopping. Without the CGM, there's just, in my opinion, I don't know how to make any of that happen. Like, maybe there's a way, but if there is a way, you're listening to the wrong podcast, because I can't quite figure it out. Right. So I think those CGMs are absolutely stunning. I want to know how you talk about using a glucose monitor with your patients. I want to know how you talk about using a glucose monitor with your patients.
One of the big things I usually say when people are really either considering one or they've been using one for a long time, but they may not really be using it to their benefit, let's say. They're looking, like you kind of alluded to, just the number, right? What's the number? What's the number? They're not learning from it, because there certainly is some optimization when you start using a continuous monitor. But of any form of technology, I might have said this before. I mean, if I were to have to choose between a pump or a CGM, I would say, please let me keep my CGM.
Right.
Right? Because even then, if I had to go back to multiple daily injections, I can micromanage that as long as I know the direction of where things are headed. I can, and with a pump, then it just brings in more precision. So using a CGM along with a pump is another huge beneficial tool, to management. So I guess as far as that, it's really helping people to learn what's the benefit of that trend that they're seeing. Because I think in the end, many people I find tend to overreact to the trend too. And, oh my goodness, things are going up or going down. Well, you have to make some considerations within that trend then too, because have you just eaten? Is there a load of insulin here? Have you just exercised? All of those variables that could be there are a reason for some of that trend, just like the guy with the M&Ms, right? He knew something was going on with his M&Ms. He didn't want to be high. So he's like, awesome, I'm going to use this and fiddle with it and figure it out. So, CGMs can give you that figuring piece that you don't have with finger sticks alone. I mean, again, doing 1 million finger sticks before I actually had a CGM per day, I was still missing all of the pieces in between. I was missing, when did it start to rise or when did it start to fall? Yeah, I know that I'm like 40 points higher now than I was after I ate my meal, but why and where did the rise actually start? Right? So those are some of the biggest pieces. And I think getting people over the overreaction to the trending is something. It's hard for many people to be able to try to say, okay, things are rising. You ate now. Let's do some self-experimentation. Let's see, is this happening today? Around 80% of your most common foods, which most people have about 20 to 25 foods that are pretty common for them to eat over and over. Use your CGM to your advantage. That's 85% of your management then. Yeah. Is figuring out. And that's the reason that you have, outside of not, let's say, carb counting in the real sense of doing it, you have a sense just based on the meal, because you've done it so much, you can say, this should probably be about 12 units, or that's more about 5 units. I mean, Ginger actually does the same thing. She doesn't really carb count truly. She's like, this green apple that I eat every morning with peanut butter takes 2 units. Yeah. And using a CGM, then I think that's the biggest thing for management is the figuring that it allows.
Yeah. So I think that you hear a lot of people in the beginning talk about like that anxiety, right? There was a huge concern in the beginning of CGM. A lot of old school people in the diabetes space were like, this is going to make people crazy. They're just going to stare at that thing all the time. And that probably did happen to some people. But again, it's like I say all the time, like if you're looking at what's happening to your blood sugar and thinking of it as a mistake, that's your mistake, right? It should be like, let me experience this. Let me see what this is. Let me see what happens when I put the insulin in here versus in there. And that quickly died down. You quickly heard even some of the more ardent, I don't know what to call them, but naysayers calmed down after a while, and saw the value in it. I thought the most important thing was to explain to people that it's not just an alarm for when you're low. And I use that phrase in anytime I speak somewhere on this podcast. I say, look, if you're looking at your CGM as a don't die alarm, you're making a huge mistake. Right. It is the very least of what it does. And so, I mean, it's cool that it tells you, oh my God, your blood sugar is getting really low really fast.
Right.
Like, that's amazing. Don't get me wrong. It's gonna help you.
You can't turn one of those alarms off, that it's always there no matter how much you hate that noise. It's there.
The FDA tells them, look, under 55, we're gonna bang an alarm in people's ears, and there's nothing they can do about it. And fair, right? But if that's what you're looking at it as, it's incredibly short-sighted. When people say to me all the time, like, Arden's tolerances are, her low alarm is set at 70, and on my phone, her high alarm is 120. On her phone, it's 130. So I like to have if she's raising up, I like to be able to think about it for a couple of minutes before I involve her in the conversation. Sure. I don't want her beeping at 120, right? But people say, oh, it must beep all the time. It must be beeping constantly. And I'm like, no, it never beeps. And that's actually how... Don't worry, I'll get back to my thought about moving down the high Dexcom alarm after these messages from Omnipod and Dexcom. Let's start first with Omnipod, the tubeless insulin pump that Arden has been using since she was 4 years old, over a decade now. Choosing Omnipod all of those years ago was, and remains to this day, one of the best diabetes decisions that my family has ever made. And I'd like to tell you why. With Omnipod, you do not have to disconnect for activity. With a tube pump, you'll have to take your pump off to play soccer or to go swimming, to take a shower, and if you're an adult, you're having adult time, you might want to take it off for that too. But not Omnipod. Omnipod is always with you. And why is that important? Because you're always getting your basal insulin. It's a completely underappreciated idea. But when you take your pump off for a half an hour, 2 hours to go play a sport, you're not getting insulin. And sure, while you're running around, it might seem like, oh, this is fine. But eventually you're going to experience a high blood sugar from that. Getting a constant flow of background insulin is incredibly important. And only Omnipod allows you to wear their device throughout your life without having to take it off for any of the, activities that you enjoy so much. I want you to go to myomnipod.com/juicebox or to the links in your show notes or at juiceboxpodcast.com. You can do that today and absolutely for free and with zero obligation. Omnipod will send you out a pod experience kit, a free demo of the pod that you can actually hold, feel, touch, keep it in your hand, see what it is, and then wear it. You get to test drive it before you buy. It's a non-working pod. Don't worry. It doesn't have insulin in it or a cannula or anything like that, but it's an exact replica of what you'll be wearing. So you can feel the weight and the size and decide for yourself if you'd like to try it. myomnipod.com/juicebox. Now on to Dexcom. The Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor is, without a doubt, the Cadillac of continuous glucose monitors. Everything you hear me talk about on this podcast is predicated on the data and information that comes back from Arden's Dexcom G6. We don't need a big, long ad for this. Dexcom.com/juicebox. Get started right now. You need to see what direction your blood sugar is going and how fast it's getting there. And you want to be able to see your loved ones remotely with an Android or iPhone. Come on. Dexcom.com/juicebox. Get going today. If you've been hesitant, please trust me when I tell you there's absolutely no reason to not move forward with Dexcom. There are links for all of the advertisers at juiceboxpodcast.com or in the show notes of the podcast app that you're listening to right now. I implore you, don't wait another second. Go tubeless with Omnipod. Get the information you need from Dexcom and support Dancing for Diabetes. It must be beeping constantly. And I'm like, no, it never beeps. And that's actually how the kind of this way that we talk about doing this here, this being fluid, it makes diabetes a very much a smaller part of your day because you're not thinking about it. Because when it does beep, it's trying to leave this tight range. I'll just bump it back down again.
Right.
When you put that threshold up at 400 because you're like, I don't want to hear this thing beep. Well, that means that by the time you think to look at it 2 hours later and your blood sugar's 280, right now
you've missed it.
Yeah, and now you've all this mistimed insulin. Now you're putting in a bunch of insulin to bring it down. You're insulin resistant, so it doesn't work as well. Suddenly you're going to be low later. Later you'll feed the low. You won't have the nerve to bolus. You get on the roller coaster. I'd rather know now. I talk about it in a million different ways. I open bills I don't think I can pay on day one because I want to know what they are, right? I want to know when her blood sugar's trying to go over 120. And if you do that, there's a great episode way back in the podcast with a scientist from Dexcom. There was a study done. The lower you lower your high alarm on your CGM, the lower your A1C goes.
Yeah.
Because you react sooner with less insulin, stopping a rise and staving off a future low because you're only using a tiny bit of insulin. We've talked about it before. You're going to listen through these things again. They're going to make total sense to you. I want to address when people say, well, I don't want to wear a bunch of stuff. You know, some adults just don't want to wear things. That's fine. But I hear a lot of parents, I don't want to look at her. I don't want to look at him and see him attached to something. He's not a robot. He's not like that kind of stuff. Arden hated that CGM the first day she put it on, right? And I wouldn't think she thinks twice about it anymore. Not even a little bit. She rolled out the door this morning for school in a pair of leggings. You can see her CGM on her hip. She doesn't care. She's wearing a top that doesn't go all the way down to her belt. Her Omnipod is sticking out like in that gap of space on her belly. She doesn't think twice about it. You can make those things normal, and they will be, you know, at some point. So I don't know. For me, CGM is about reacting, and instead of, you know,
appropriately reacting, rather than being proactive, really. Mm-hmm. If you have a CGM, you can be proactive, rather than having to always be reactive at like you said, have your CGM set at 400 and you're finally seeing it at 280 because you're not feeling the greatest. You could have been proactive well above or well ahead of that.
Right. And that proactiveness, by the way, takes less time and less of your involvement than it does to be 280 and fighting with it for hours after that. It seems counterintuitive because people say to me all the time, you must be so involved all the time. And I'm like, man, I don't think about diabetes for more than about 10 minutes a day. You know, like on the really bad days, 20 minutes. But I'm not mired down in it. Like there's no hand wringing in my house all day long, like staring at big numbers, wondering when they're going to come down. Are they going to make lows? We just don't have that. Right. I mean, I'm generalizing to make my point. It happens sometimes, right?
Yes.
But as a day-to-day idea, it is not something that occurs here. Mm-hmm. And if you've heard me speak somewhere, in my slide presentation, there's a picture of Muhammad Ali standing over top of someone he's just knocked out. And I always start that part by going, has anyone ever been in a fist fight? And inevitably, it's always a little kid who's like, I have, like off into the background. And I was like, well, you shouldn't hit people. But you know, I tell people all the time, I'm like, you want to act. Like we talk about you want to react, but really you want to be able to act first, right? You want to make a decision first because besides stopping an arrow, there's the concept of cause and effect.
Correct.
Right? And there's this idea that, you know, people always run around yelling, well, that's just diabetes. Every time something happens, they don't understand that was just diabetes. And I always say that when you're saying, well, that's just diabetes, what you really mean is, I don't know how to use insulin correctly.
Right.
Right. And so your blood sugar doesn't go up to 400 because the diabetes fairy tapped you on the head. Like there's a reason. I don't know what it is, maybe. You might not know what it is, but there's a reason. So at the very least, if you act first, then with some confidence, you can say that what happened next was a result of your action. And at least you're not always covering your face in defense, like a boxer who just can't get a punch in anymore, right? Diabetes is not pummeling you in the face. You maybe you hit it too hard. Maybe you end up with a 65 you didn't mean to, but at least you know, wow, I put that insulin in here and I got to 65. Next time I'll use less. Next time I'll do my pre-bolus 5 minutes shorter. Whatever it ends up being, I don't know, right?
Right.
But I'm a big fan of acting first and then taking that feedback and making a better decision next time with it.
Absolutely. And that's why I think it's when you're, especially if you're new to CGM or starting out sort of over with a CGM, or you haven't used it consistently on a day-to-day basis because you have felt more frustrated about it. Mm-hmm. I think if you get it down to some basics of use to begin with.
Yes.
And like you said, kind of tighten up those targets. Even if it's just a short time period, you can designate and say, okay, for the next 7 days, I'm going to have my target set, the high alert for 130 and the low alert set for maybe 70 or even 80 if you're hypo unaware, or you just really worried or whatever about the lower end, because tightening it up helps, but also then fitting in more of your regular habits in that testing time period. Your typical foods, the things that you like to eat for breakfast or lunch or for dinner or for snacks. Because if you're committing to using something by applying it to your body and being a robot, essentially.
In for a penny, in for a pound.
That's right, exactly. If you're committing to using it, then get everything that you should be getting out of using it.
And there's a way to start. Like, in my opinion, I'm interested in what you think, but I think that when you first have a CGM on and you're accustomed to wearing it, finally, you know what this information means. The first thing you do is you get your basal right. Yes. Like to me, it's basal first. Make sure your basal's right. And I tell people all the time, if you haven't had insulin or food for 3 or so hours and your blood sugar is not 85, your basal's not right. And so if you're 180 or 200, shoot lower. Don't shoot for 85 right away. Shoot for lower and keep kind of just cranking it down. After you've got your basal in a situation where you're staying pretty stable most of the time without getting low, then you can start thinking about pre-bolus. And then the CGM can really help you with that too. If I'm 120 and I haven't had food or insulin for hours, when I put in some insulin here, how soon before I start seeing a diagonal arrow? Is it 10 minutes, 15, 20? Some people say a half an hour. Everybody's number is different. So once your basal's right, and you can trust the cause and effect that I've bolused now, and it took 15 minutes, let's say, for my blood sugar to start going down, within reason, trust that that's probably your pre-bolus, 15 minutes, right? When your blood sugar's in range. Now, keep in mind, if your blood sugar is higher, you'll be more insulin resistant. That pre-bolus time won't be the same. But for the sake of the conversation, now you have your basal right. Now you know your pre-bolus time. Now you can start using insulin and being a little more aggressive with it. I've put a pre-bolus in. I'm 90 diagonal down. I've started to eat. My blood sugar shot up. Now here's where the CGM becomes incredibly helpful. So you've got your insulin in. You've eaten, but you're going up. Are you going up like a sharp incline, right? Or is it what I call the Price is Right? You know, the Price is Right, which is it, the miner, the climber, the guy, it's like yodelay hee, and
yes.
And he's got the pick in his hand, he's going back and forth, and it's this very gentle grade that goes on forever, and you watch it the whole time going, oh, he's going to stop, oh, he'll definitely stop, there's no way he's going to fall off the edge, it's not going to happen, through the whole thing, and it just keeps going. That's that CGM line that it tricks you. Because you keep thinking it's not on a crazy incline. I'm not shooting up. I'm just climbing. It's going to stop in a minute. But no, it's not. And so not most of the time. Most of the time, I find a gentle grade up means you almost got the amount right. And your
there's a deficit, though.
Right. And your pre-bolus might have been not quite long enough, right? The sharp up is a complete... I just thought to curse, but it's a complete cluster, right? Like you didn't have nearly enough pre-bolus and you did not use nearly enough food. So there was nothing about your bolus that even gave resistance to that carb impact at all. Right. So you can even
more often with that arrow up, more often it's a pre-bolus, especially if you are using a ratio for your carbs and counting your carbs and whatnot. Most often, if you have a pretty significant, quick, straight up or double up arrow within 30 minutes, 45 minutes of a meal, there's a deficit there, and or the deficit is more because you did not pre-bolus. There wasn't time, like that tug of war between the insulin that you said, in a podcast before. There was not enough time to let insulin get the upper hand.
Yeah, right. And I'll tell you that exact situation, that scenario you're describing, that taught me how to over-bolus. So the first time I put in insulin and her blood sugar started to shoot up, I just made the leap. I was like, I missed big time. And I didn't just put in like another half unit. Like I crushed it. I was like, I'm going to stop these arrows. If I have to feed them later, I will, but I'm not going to let this blood sugar go up like this. And so I realized a meal that I thought was going to take 5 units with no pre-bolus needed 8 units. And so that taught me in the future, when I don't have time to pre-bolus, I'll just give 8 units for the 5-unit meal, because I can create that action of insulin and overpower this even without a pre-bolus if I use too much. It's a little more, I call it like, that's definitely more of a pro level tip kind of a situation. I'm like, you're more of a diabetes ninja once you're doing stuff like that. I hold that up with the same ideas after you've had a 32 low and you start coming back up again and you bolus, like when you're 50 diagonal up, like you're a ninja at that point. You're just like...
I need a lot more, because I know I ate 60 grams of carb and I really only needed like 15 or whatever it was.
And when you start knowing how much insulin to bolus to overcome not pre-bolusing, again, you've been at this a while, but I learned that from the Dexcom. Like I never would have so, when you see those arrows flying up, it's not woe is me time, right? It's what is happening. Like what could I do next time? Over-bolusing is an incredible tool. So,
and over-bolusing in the way that you're doing it is I think we talked about this before, it's actually what John Walsh from Pumping Insulin, he calls it a super bolus. Right. And he does it in a little bit more of a calculated way. He says, you take the bolus that's suggested by your pump for the food that you're going to eat, or the calculated, let's say you said, okay, she needs 5 units for this all the time. Well, today there's no time to pre-bolus. Usually you would have done a 20-minute pre-bolus for that 5 units. Okay. He says you're then going to take the insulin and basal that's running behind that meal for 2 hours, and you're going to actually add it on to that 5 units or whatever your pump is suggesting. So maybe if your basal is running at a unit an hour, that's 2 units of extra insulin. You're going to pop that on top of the suggested bolus. But then behind the scenes, and you probably do this a lot too, with that heavier bolus up front, you're like, I'm probably going to need to watch and do a temp basal decrease for a little bit after because possible. I know that this is too much in the end result, right? We don't want to cause a low. He says to start by just taking the basal down to 0 for about 2 hours. Yeah. And then evaluating. I've got people who use it and say, I tried it. The super bolus part of it works, but I don't need to turn my basal completely off. I only need to do a 50% basal instead of 100% off.
Yes. And that's where the Dexcom, again, comes in incredibly handy. You need it when you need it. You don't when you don't.
Right.
And then I consider that idea trading basal for bolus. Like there are times where I think, Arden's, basal rate's 1.4 an hour. I just bolused 1.5 units. Listen, there's going to be a moment, right? There's a moment for everybody. And there is going to be a moment where you see the arrow up, put in the insulin, 5 seconds later, the arrow flattens out and you go, oh my God, I didn't need that insulin, right? That's when I'll trade the basal for the bolus. Then I'll just
you can always say, cut the basal off. Exactly. But do you know that? Do you know that if you don't have a CGM? You don't.
No,
you don't know when
that
transition was happening, right? If you had none and you were very aggressive about just finger sticking and you were like, oh my gosh, 20 minutes ago it was here and now it's like 50 points higher. I have to slam this with more insulin. Awesome. But if you're not willing to do finger sticks, then like every 20 minutes after that to see where things are going, you never know when that horizontal is coming or when a downtrend is coming either.
Yep. I am right now texting Arden while you and I are talking. So what I say, it has now been 1 hour and 12 minutes since she got her bolus for her food. I got a little, I didn't panic, but because you and I were talking and I could see what was happening, I shut off the very tail end of her extended bolus and her temp basal.
Yep.
And now she's 105 diagonal up. I'm bolusing that because I'm putting in the insulin that I bailed on from the extended bolus and the basal. I should have trusted myself, right? And so instead I'm putting it back again. And I will stop this diagonal up arrow around 115, 120. She'll float there for a while. We'll come back down. I expect her to be 85 by like 1 hour and 45 minutes from now.
And the interesting thing about that too is what you're saying in terms of her management. And I know her A1C has been like in the 5%
for a long time,
for a long time. But the bigger beyond that, and we did a whole long podcast about A1C and kind of what that all means, right? But I think bringing in to the fact here, CGM translates into that CGM because what we're really hoping for is more gentle rolling hills within our target rather than these major rises and falls of a roller coaster. And if you start to analyze your data in CGM, you can actually start then to be able to say, okay, I need to tighten things up here. I've got an awesome looking A1C, but I have a huge what's called standard deviation, which speaks to the variability between highs and lows, right? So you may have this awesome looking A1C, but if you're going up and down and you look like a big jagged, roller coaster or mountain range, that's not helpful. Your standard deviation value should actually be low, which means the variance between the highs and lows are also more gentle.
More of a rolling river, right? And the way I found to say that to people is that if you were 350 and then 60 and then 350 and then 60, all you're doing is tricking the A1C test. If it comes back and tells you, hey, you have an average A1C of 7, which you do when you average 60 and 350 again, but you also have you're also not living in a healthy way in any specific way. So don't let that number fool you.
Right.
And Jenny's right. There is an episode called All About A1C that she and I did probably more than a year or so ago.
Yeah.
And I'll link it in the show notes so you can find it. But I have Arden's last 5 days, and her let's see. Her average blood sugar over the last 5 days has been 114. She's been in range 56% of the time, which probably seems low, except that her range is from 70 to 120. Mm-hmm. That's another thing you need to be careful of when you look at these reports. If you have your high set at 300 and your low set at 60, and you tell me I'm in range 100% of the time, well,
right. Oh, sure you are.
Yeah. I mean, good.
But what's your standard deviation within that time in range?
Right. What is that? And standard deviation is just a simple mathematical idea that I didn't understand in school and still don't understand now. But it's a basic, right? It's an average. Is it an average of? Maybe it's a mean. I don't know. See, I didn't pay attention to math. You know, it's funny. You were talking about Walsh earlier, talking about like all these ideas about like overbowl, his Super Bolus. And I call it overbolusing. And when I think about it, all I think about is more. Like the word more just pops into my head. More insulin.
Right.
And
he's
more. Over there like with his college degree being like, what you want to do is for 2 hours and this and this. I'm like, more.
Right. But you've also figured it out. I mean, your more is not a dangerous more.
It's not a random more, no.
It's not a random. You've figured it out in your, this is your diabetes may vary. Mm-hmm. You've figured it out in Arden's diabetes. Right. You know how much more to give. It's not like you're slamming in 5 more units. You're like, she needs, based on experience, about a unit more. Yeah. Or she needs, based on experience, 2 units more based on what went in, what has transpired up to this point.
People who listen to the podcast know that if this wasn't a special episode called Diabetes Pro Tip Continuous Glucose Monitor, I would just call it Roger Moore, because you have no idea how many times I hear from people. And they're like, could you just make the title something about what's in it? I'm like, no, I can't. That's not fun at all. I want to talk for a second about what happens when you get your brand new shiny Dexcom on and it tells you your blood sugar is 90, but then you test with your meter and your meter says your blood sugar is 140, and you go, I don't know which one of these things to believe. So I think it's important to note that a CGM is measuring interstitial fluid.
Correct.
Your meter is measuring your blood.
Thank you for bringing that up. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Both of them have an FDA requirement of only being within 20% of range. So if a meter says your blood sugar is 100, it could very easily be 80 or 120 or somewhere between 80 and 120. As people living with type 1 diabetes in the 2000s, you're going to have to accept that this is pretty much the best we have right now, and not to make yourself mental. So imagine that your CGM tells you you're 100, but it's off by 20% high. So you're really 120. And your meter says you're 140, but it's really off by 20% low. So you're really 120. They both agree. The numbers you're seeing don't agree. You cannot spend a ton of time being upset about that.
No.
You have to pick something and believe in it. And I know that's crazy, but I tell people all the time, there's somebody online who's like, look, my meter says this and my Dexcom says this. And I'm like, you're holding a brand new Dexcom G6 in your hand and a meter that was made 12 years ago. And you're telling me I believe the meter. And I always ask them the same thing. Why did you decide to believe the meter over the CGM? Is it because you had it longer? Because it's testing blood and that seems like something that's more accurate to you? Like, what is the random thought your brain has had that's made you decide that one of these is more accurate than the other one? Which do you... I test sometimes when I'm not sure.
So really, I mean, blood glucose is the first line of glucose change. Mm-hmm. It is.
Yep, you see it there first.
Interstitial glucose follows blood glucose. And so with those random, differences, most often I would say people on G5 and G6, for the most part, have pretty good accuracy, finger stick to actual CGM. Where I think a lot of discrepancy can honestly come in is from a finger stick value of, let's say it's telling you 140, right? And you're looking at your CGM and it's 100. Well, as we kind of started out saying, it's not about the number on the CGM, it's about the trend.
Right.
And like you do very often, you're saying, okay, now there's a trend going up. You just bolused what you missed giving before because you started to see a trend up.
Yep.
Well, her finger stick might actually be reflecting a higher glucose than what the CGM is showing right now because, again, glucose changes first in your bloodstream. And so CGM is going to lag, especially in those time periods of more significant glucose change, such as after food or after or during exercise. That can be a varying time. So finger stick 140, your CGM is trending up, or you've got an angled arrow heading up and it's telling you you're 102 and you're like, well, what do I do about this? The CGM just hasn't met yet the glucose value in the bloodstream. It will catch up.
Right.
It will. It's just that it hasn't gotten there yet because really, if you think about the way that glucose sort of moves in a simplified form, it moves out of the bloodstream, sort of has to move through interstitial fluid before it gets to the cells to get absorbed, essentially. I mean, that's simplified, but so your interstitial fluid is also always, for the most part, going to lag, especially in special times like food and movement.
Yeah. And I'll tell you too, and to circle back around to the idea of the quality of your meter. Arden's had an Omnipod forever, like since she was 4. So she's going to be 15 soon. Point is, that thing's been around a long time. It's got an old freestyle meter in it. They've always been kind of wonky. And now we're using the Contour Next One. It's the little tiny meter that's going to start coming.
Most accurate on the market.
Yep. So when Omnipod decided to switch over to Dash, which should, you might be listening to this and Dash might be a thing already, but it's about to happen. They're going to offer you a free Contour Next One meter to come with it. So I've been using it for a few months to get my head around it. It's spectacular.
It is.
Like, what a great, accurate meter. It's absolutely insane. Like, compared to what was in that PDM, it was nuts how much better it was.
Well, and this brings up for the people, too, who might still be using a G5 or a CGM that requires calibration, what you calibrate with.
Yeah, even that
really makes accuracy on the CGM hold better.
Right. And if you're calibrating with a bad meter, say you have a G5 that still asks for calibration, and the G5 says it's 90, but you've tested with a 10-year-old meter, it's like, it's not, it's 150. What if you really are 90, and now you're telling the G5 everything you think is wrong, you're 150. But the algorithm's like, that's not right, we're 90. Right. And then you confuse it, and then it blows up.
And then it gives you three question marks for 3 hours, and you're like, God darn it.
And then you go, there's something wrong with the CGM. Actually, no, it was you. You put the wrong information in. And so none of this technology is obviously perfect. But again, I always like to say, you're not boiling your urine to find out what your blood sugar is, so you're doing great. Yeah, right? You're doing great.
Thankfully.
All I can say for sure as we kind of come up on the end here, and I'm going to ask you to kind of sum up in a second, but what I can tell you is that, as I've said before, Arden's A1C has been between 5.2 and 6.2 for 5 solid years. And it's going to be a lot to do with the tools that you hear us talking about here on the podcast and how I've learned to implement them. But how I learned to implement them was the information coming back to me from Arden's glucose monitor. So if you have an opportunity to get one, and I know they're not covered by everybody's insurance and they can be expensive, but if you can get one, you absolutely, in my opinion, should. Absolutely, it will just change your life. So
correct.
Yeah.
I 100% agree.
Thank you. Did we forget anything? Because at this point, people who listen probably aren't surprised, but I don't pre-plan these with Jenny. She put on her headphones. She goes, "What are we talking about?" I'm like, "CGM," and she goes, "Great," and then we just started talking. But again, I like the way these conversations flow. So did I forget anything that is like wildly wrong of me not to have said?
I don't think so. I do think that if, this is just from an education standpoint, your own education with your CGM. If you really need some pointers, it's helpful to look or ask more of your care team. If you do need some pointers, some endos and CDEs are really awesome. Some don't know much more than just telling you how to slap it on. Yeah. But look beyond, because there's a wealth of benefit to knowing, and some of it is self-experimentation. In fact, I think a lot of it's self-experimentation. But if you need some help with looking at things, I think searching out somebody can be helpful.
Yeah. Somebody who can look at the graph and just make sense of it in a second. Yeah. I know we've talked about it before. I can, at this point, I can look at someone's 3-hour graph and go, is this where you put in the insulin? And they're like, how did you know? I'm like, yeah, because it should have been here and it wasn't enough and this would have stopped that. And like, it's pretty easy to see after you can see it, right? It's like those, you know what it's like? It's like those posters that you look at it and you're like, somebody tells you it's a tree and it's a sailboat and you stare at it long enough and it turns into a tree. I think that's what happens. Like after you look at it long enough, I know people can get scared of the idea of data. I don't like the word because I think it scares people off. Like, you need to understand the data. Well, that sounds scary to me.
It does.
Right. There's a little line on your thing, okay? That line tries to go in a direction. You look and see where you put the insulin in. You see how harshly the line tried to go in that direction. You make a better decision next time.
You know, I think that actually brings in one point that we may have missed is that especially Dexcom does allow you to use event markers. So if you are really wanting more optimization and you're the only one who can really look at your lines and your info using the event markers. I know in G6 at the bottom of at least your screen on your phone app, you can just choose events. You can log things like food or exercise or illness or even alcohol and like your cycle or monthly and all that kind of stuff. It'll put little marks on your actual trend graph. And that way you can make more sense of the if you're, again, the one that's really trying to look back for what happened, why did it happen?
You don't have to remember that I ate lunch at 11:30. You can just say food and maybe the amount of carbs and make a note about what the food was.
Right.
And that helps you when you look back. See, again, that's way better thought out than I can ever be. But that makes a lot of sense. And that's why you're here. You're the smart part of this conversation. No. I'm the chit-chatty part of the conversation.
We're both important for reasons.
I'm pretty sure that's true. Okay, I think you have to go in a couple of minutes, right? So
I do.
I'm going to let you go now and say goodbye.
I want to thank Ascensia Diabetes for sponsoring the Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series. Don't forget, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit at contournext.com/Juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. If you're enjoying the remastered episodes of the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast, you have Touched by Type 1 to thank. TouchedByType1.org is a proud sponsor of the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Learn more about them at touchedbytype1.org. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, listen, there's 26 episodes in this series. You might not know what each of them are. I'm going to tell you now. Episode 1000 is called Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. Episode 1001, all about MDI. 1002, all about insulin. 1003 is called Pre-Bolus. Episode 1004, Temp Basal. 1005, Insulin Pumping. 1006, Mastering a CGM. 1007, Bump and Nudge. 1008, The Perfect Bolus. 1009, Variables. 1010, Setting Basal Insulin. 1011, Exercise. 1012, Fat and Protein. 1013, Insulin Injury and Surgery. 1014, Glucagon and Low BGs. In episode 1015, Jenny and I talk about emergency room protocols. In 1016, Long-Term Health. 1017, Bump and Nudge Part 2. In episode 1018, Pregnancy. 1019, Explaining Type 1. 1020, Glycemic Index and Load. 1021, Postpartum. 1022, Weight Loss. 1023, Honeymoon. 1024, Female Hormones. And in episode 1025, we talk about transitioning from MDI to pumping. Before I go, I'd like to share 2 reviews with you of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, one from an adult and one from a caregiver. I learned so much from the Pro Tip series when our son was diagnosed last summer. It really helped get me through those first few very tough weeks. It wasn't just your explanations of how it all works. which were way better than anything our diabetes educator told us. But something about the way you and Jenny presented everything, even the scary stuff, that reassured me that we could figure out how to deal with this and to teach our son how to deal with it too. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. This podcast is a game changer. 25 years as a type 1 diabetic, and only now am I learning some of the basics. Scott brings useful information and presents it in digestible ways. Learning that pre-bolus doesn't just mean bolus before you eat, but means timing your insulin so it is active as the carbs become active, took me already from a decent 6.5 A1C down to a 5.6 in the past 8 months. I've never met Scott, but after listening to hundreds of episodes and joining him in his Facebook group, I consider him a friend. Listening to this podcast and applying it has been the best thing I have done for my health since diagnosis. I genuinely hope that the Diabetes Pro Tip series is valuable for you and your family. If it is, find me in the private Facebook group and say hello. If you're enjoying the Juicebox Podcast, please share it with a friend, a neighbor, your physician, or someone else who you know that might also benefit from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Jenny Smith holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. She's also had type 1 diabetes for over 35 years, and she works at integrateddiabetes.com. If you're interested in hiring Jenny, you can learn more about her at that link. If you're living with diabetes or are the caregiver of someone who is, and you're looking for an online community of supportive people who understand, check out the Juicebox Podcast private Facebook group, Juicebox Podcast Type 1 Diabetes. There are over 41,000 active members, and we add 300 new members every week. There is a conversation happening right now that would interest you, inform you, or give you the opportunity to share something that you've learned. Juicebox Podcast, Type 1 Diabetes on Facebook. And it's not just for type 1s. Any kind of diabetes, any way you're connected to it, you are invited to join this absolutely free and welcoming community.